There are nights when silence feels heavier than noise, when a person smiles in front of the world but fights battles nobody can see. And if you are hearing these words right now, then maybe this message found you for a reason, because some people were chosen to walk through storms that would destroy ordinary minds. Some souls were allowed to face betrayal, rejection, loneliness, and pain not because God abandoned them, but because heaven was preparing them for a level most people could never survive. And what makes your story different is this: you are still standing after everything that tried to erase you, still breathing after situations that should have broken your spirit completely. And today something shifts forever, because the season that tortured you has already reached its ending. The chapter of endless suffering has closed, and no force on earth can reopen what God has already declared finished. The people around you may not understand why you changed, why your eyes carry a different depth now, why your silence feels heavier than words, but deep inside your spirit already knows. You are no longer the same person who entered the fire. You walked in wounded and uncertain, but you walked out carrying something dangerous, wisdom born from survival, strength forged through pressure, and an authority that darkness can no longer challenge the same way again. Most people never realize that pain has limits. Suffering lies to you and whispers that it will last forever, convinces the mind that tomorrow will feel exactly like yesterday. But that is one of the oldest traps ever created, because every season has an ending written before it even begins, and the battles you faced were never random accidents falling from the sky. There was purpose hidden inside every delay, every betrayal, every sleepless night where you cried without anyone knowing. The enemy believed that if the pressure continued long enough, then eventually your spirit would collapse under the weight of disappointment. They thought repeated heartbreak would make you bitter, repeated rejection would make you give up, repeated attacks would convince you that your life had no value. But something unexpected happened. You survived longer than the darkness expected. You kept moving when they thought you would stop. You kept praying when silence was the only answer you heard. And with every moment you endured, the power behind those attacks slowly weakened until the cycle itself began collapsing from exhaustion, because cycles only survive when people surrender to them, and you refuse to surrender even while bleeding inside. There is a reason the same kind of pain kept appearing in different forms throughout your life, because darkness does not create new weapons every day. It recycles old patterns, hoping one of them will finally destroy your spirit. Maybe it came through betrayal from people you trusted. Maybe it came through failure that embarrassed you publicly. Maybe it came through loneliness that made you question your worth, but every repeated attack carried the same hidden assignment: to trap you inside a loop where you would eventually stop believing in yourself. And for a while, it probably felt endless, like every time you healed another wound opened, every time you rebuilt another storm arrived. But what the enemy never understood was that your spirit was learning while surviving. Every painful season sharpened your discernment, every disappointment strengthened your endurance. Every betrayal taught you what masks really look like, and slowly the very pain meant to weaken you began transforming into armor nobody could see, because people who survive deep suffering never remain ordinary. Their eyes change, their instincts sharpen, and their souls develop a strength that cannot be taught through comfort. Something terrifying happens when a chosen person refuses to break. The entire system designed to destroy them starts failing from within. And that is exactly what happened in your life. The pressure increased because darkness became desperate. Attacks multiplied because your survival threatened forces that depended on your destruction. They thought if they threw enough fear, confusion, heartbreak, and exhaustion at you all at once, then surely this would be the moment you finally collapsed. But heaven had already decided otherwise, because God never allows fire without purpose, and every battle you faced carried hidden preparation. Inside it, preparation for a future version of yourself that could not exist without the crushing, the tears, and the isolation. This is why you now feel different, even if you cannot explain it fully. Old situations no longer control your emotions the same way. Old temptations feel empty. Old manipulations no longer trap your mind, because survival elevated you beyond the reach of the same suffering that once hunted you. You outgrew the frequency where those attacks had access, and here is what most people never understand about spiritual warfare. The enemy studies weakness, but heaven studies endurance. Darkness only knows how to attack vulnerable places, But God watches who continues walking even after the attack lands, and every moment you kept moving forward despite fear became evidence that your spirit carried something stronger than destruction itself. This is why some people around you suddenly feel uncomfortable in your presence now, because surviving pain changes a person in ways words cannot explain. You no longer chase approval the same way, you no longer tolerate disrespect the same way, and you no longer fear losing people who were never sent to protect your peace in the first place. Suffering burned away illusions that comfort could never remove, and although the process felt cruel at times, it revealed a version of you that was hidden beneath fear and insecurity. All along, there comes a moment in every chosen person's life when the battle quietly shifts without announcement, and most people miss it because nothing changes outwardly at first. The same streets remain, the same faces exist, the same world continues moving, but internally, everything becomes different. Suddenly the attacks that once crushed your spirit barely disturb your peace. Suddenly situations that once controlled your emotions lose their power completely. Suddenly the people who manipulated you before cannot reach you anymore, no matter how hard they try. And that shift happens because survival creates immunity. Just like the body learns to resist sickness after exposure, the soul learns to recognize destruction before it fully enters again. Your discernment became sharper through pain, your instincts became stronger through betrayal, and your spirit developed defenses that did not exist before the fire. What nearly destroyed you actually trained you for the future. And this is why you must stop viewing your survival as accidental, because ordinary people do not walk through that level of pressure and come out stronger. Ordinary minds do not survive repeated heartbreak without becoming completely bitter, but somehow you carried wounds that should have buried your identity and still managed to keep a heart capable of hope. That is not weakness. That is evidence of divine protection operating even during your darkest nights. And although there were moments when you questioned God's silence, heaven was never absent from your suffering. Every tear was counted. Prayer was heard, every injustice was recorded, even when nobody defended you publicly. And now the season of payment has ended, because the assignment attached to your pain has already been completed. The dangerous thing about surviving deep suffering is that it changes how darkness sees you forever, because once the enemy throws its strongest weapons at someone and still fails to destroy them, fear begins shifting directions. Suddenly the forces that hunted you realize they are no longer dealing with the same fragile person they attacked before. They recognize that your spirit now carries experience, wisdom, and authority built through survival itself. This is why certain attacks cannot repeat with the same force again, because the version of you standing today already understands their patterns, already recognizes their traps, already senses manipulation before it fully forms. And once darkness loses surprise, it loses much of its power. The same arrows that once pierced your heart now bounce off lessons you learned through fire. And maybe the hardest part of your journey was how lonely it felt while it was happening, because people can sympathize with temporary pain, but very few understand prolonged suffering. Very few understand what it feels like to keep smiling while secretly fighting exhaustion inside your soul. And there were moments when even you doubted whether things would ever change, moments where silence felt endless and hope felt dangerous. But those were the exact moments heaven was watching most carefully, because endurance reveals character in ways comfort never can. And although your suffering looked meaningless at times, it was actually separating you from the old version of yourself piece by piece, stripping away dependency on people, stripping away fear of rejection, stripping away illusions that kept you spiritually asleep, until eventually all that remained was the real you, the version forged through survival. Something powerful begins happening when a person stops fearing the very thing that once controlled them, because fear is one of the enemy's greatest weapons. And for years, suffering tried to convince you that pain would always define your future. But now you stand as living proof that destruction failed. You survived situations that should have erased your confidence completely, and because of that survival, your spirit carries a different energy now, quieter perhaps, but far stronger, and people notice it even if they cannot explain why. They feel the weight of someone who has walked through fire and returned with wisdom instead of hatred, and that kind of presence cannot be manufactured. It can only be earned through endurance. The truth is, your enemies expected your story to end differently. They believed the pressure would eventually silence you forever. They expected heartbreak to destroy your ability to trust, expected failure to destroy your confidence, expected exhaustion to destroy your dreams. But instead of disappearing, you evolved. Instead of collapsing, you adapted. And every attempt to bury you ended up building a stronger foundation beneath your spirit. This is why the same attacks cannot truly control you anymore, because your survival exposed the limits of what darkness could actually do. They already used their sharpest weapons and still failed to erase your purpose. And once that realization enters the spiritual realm, something changes permanently, because fear no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the forces that failed to destroy you. Now your life stands at the edge of a completely different season, not a season where you constantly fight to survive, but a season where the strength built through suffering begins revealing its true purpose. And although challenges will still exist, because life itself is a test, the old torment no longer carries authority over your spirit the same way. You crossed through the fire and emerged transformed, stronger, wiser, calmer, and far more dangerous to darkness than before, because the greatest threat to destruction is a person who already survived what should have killed them, and that person is who you have become, someone whose scars now speak louder than fear, someone whose endurance became proof that God never abandoned them even during the hardest nights, someone whose future can no longer be chained to the pain of the past, because the battle that once defined your existence has already ended, and the version of you walking forward now carries something the old you never had, the unshakable knowledge that if you survived that storm, then nothing ahead will ever break your spirit again. There are victories that happen quietly before the world ever notices them, moments where heaven changes a person internally long before circumstances begin changing externally, and this is the stage your life has entered now, because surviving what almost destroyed you was never the final destination. It was the doorway into a completely different identity. The old version of you operated from fear, from uncertainty, from constantly expecting disappointment to arrive again, but the version standing today carries something far more powerful, experience forged through pain, discernment sharpened through betrayal, and a spirit that now recognizes danger before it fully appears. This is why certain situations no longer shake you the way they once did, why certain people can no longer manipulate your emotions like before, because suffering transformed your spirit into something the enemy did not anticipate, and the frightening part for darkness is this: transformation cannot be reversed once it is complete. For years, you may have wondered why your battles felt heavier than the people around you, why your life seemed filled with pressure while others moved through comfort. But what you carried was never ordinary hardship. Some of the weight attached to your journey came from cycles older than you, patterns that moved silently through generations, waiting for someone strong enough to confront them, because families do not only pass down traditions and habits, they also pass down fear, emotional wounds, broken mindsets, repeated failures, and spiritual weakness that quietly controls bloodlines for decades. And eventually one person must rise who refuses to continue living under those chains. One soul must endure the fire necessary to break the pattern permanently. And whether you realized it or not, that responsibility fell upon you, which is why your suffering often felt larger than your personal story alone. There were moments when you probably asked yourself, why life kept demanding so much strength from you, why certain storms repeated in different forms, why peace always seemed temporary before another challenge appeared. But hidden inside those painful seasons was an assignment far greater than simple survival, because every cycle has to meet resistance somewhere. Every chain eventually encounters a spirit unwilling to bow before it, and your endurance became that resistance. Every time you stood back up after heartbreak, every time you continued moving despite exhaustion, every time you chose not to become bitter after betrayal, something invisible began breaking in the spiritual realm, chains that existed long before you slowly lost their grip because your spirit refused to surrender to the same patterns that defeated others. Before you, the enemy wanted your suffering to become inheritance, wanted your fear to continue through future generations, wanted your pain to define not only your life, but the lives connected to you afterward. Heaven had already chosen otherwise, because God sometimes allows one strong soul to face battles others could never survive, so an entire bloodline can finally experience freedom afterward. And although the burden felt unfair at times, your endurance carried purpose far beyond what your eyes could see during those lonely nights. This is why certain battles in your life felt strangely intense, because they were never just about the present moment. They were confrontations against cycles that Expect it to continue forever until your spirit interrupted them through survival. What makes your story dangerous now is not simply the fact that you survived, it is what your pain became after survival, because many people endure suffering without transformation. Many people leave hardship carrying more anger, more bitterness, more fear than before. But your spirit did something rare. Instead of allowing pain to poison your heart completely, you slowly converted those wounds into wisdom. Every betrayal sharpened your ability to read people clearly. Every disappointment taught you where not to place your trust blindly. Every lonely season forced you to discover strength that depended on God more than human validation. And through that process, the very poison sent to weaken your spirit became the medicine, strengthening your soul. This is why old attacks no longer affect you with the same force, because the person who once reacted emotionally to every wound no longer exists in the same way. Suffering reshaped your inner world until your weaknesses became guarded places, and now people who once had access to your peace suddenly find themselves powerless before your silence, because survival taught you boundaries, taught you discernment, taught you how to protect your spirit without losing your humanity, and that lesson alone changed the direction of your future permanently. Because once someone learns how to recognize destruction before it fully enters their life, many battles end before they even begin. There is a hidden authority carried by people who survived impossible seasons, an authority that cannot be purchased, copied, or imitated, because it only comes through enduring situations that should have destroyed your identity completely. And this authority is exactly why certain people now feel unsettled around you, even when you say nothing at all. Your presence reminds them that destruction failed. Your existence exposes the weakness of forces that once believed they controlled your destiny, and whether they admit it publicly or not, many of the same people who underestimated you now quietly study your survival, trying to understand how you escaped situations that normally break others permanently. What they fail to understand is that heaven never wastes suffering connected to purpose. Every painful lesson carved deeper wisdom into your spirit. Every tear increased your endurance. Every lonely night strengthened your relationship with God in ways comfort never could. And while darkness believed it was slowly destroying your future, heaven was secretly building your authority through the very same process. Because the strongest souls are rarely created through ease, they are forged through pressure, through silence, through battles where survival itself becomes proof of divine protection. And now your spirit carries the marks of someone who already faced the worst and returned stronger. The reason your life feels different lately is because spiritually, you no longer stand where the attacks once reached you. Survival elevated your awareness beyond certain frequencies of destruction, which is why old temptations now feel empty, old manipulations feel obvious, and old fears no longer control your decisions the same way. You cross through enough darkness to finally understand your own value, and once a person truly understands their value, they stop begging for acceptance from people who were sent to test them instead of protect them. This shift changes everything, because the enemy depends heavily on insecurity, confusion, and emotional weakness. But your suffering slowly removed those openings one by one until the doors that once allowed torment easy access began closing permanently, and perhaps the most powerful transformation happened quietly inside your mind. Because there was a time when fear dominated your thoughts, when every setback convinced you another disaster was coming, when every silence made you anxious, when every disappointment felt like confirmation that life would never improve. But surviving repeated storms eventually forced your spirit into a new understanding. You began realizing that if God carried you through those impossible seasons, before then no future battle could truly destroy you either. And this realization created something dangerous inside your soul: calmness. Because nothing terrifies darkness more than a person who no longer panics under pressure. You now carry evidence that destruction failed, evidence written not through words but through survival itself, and this evidence changes how both heaven and darkness respond to your future. Because once someone survives a level of suffering that should have erased them completely, spiritual authority begins attaching itself to their existence, not because they became perfect, but because endurance revealed the strength hidden within them, and that authority becomes visible in subtle ways. People seek your advice without understanding why. Strangers feel comfort around your energy. Broken souls recognize something familiar in your eyes, because pain transformed your presence into testimony long before you ever spoke a word about your journey. At times you may still remember the seasons that almost broke you, certain memories may still sting, certain scars may still ache quietly in moments of reflection, but notice how different you are now compared to the person who first entered those battles, because back then, fear controlled your reactions, uncertainty controlled your decisions, and pain controlled your identity. But today your spirit responds differently. You recover faster, discern quicker, and detach easier from things that threaten your peace. That is not emotional coldness, that is wisdom earned through survival. And wisdom always changes the way a person walks through life afterward. The enemy understands something many people do not. Once a chosen soul fully recognizes their own resilience, controlling them becomes almost impossible, because fear loses much of its influence after someone survives their worst nightmare, and that is why the attacks against you intensified so heavily in the past. Darkness wanted to destroy your confidence before you discovered your actual strength, wanted to keep you trapped in self-doubt before you realized how much authority survival would eventually place inside your spirit. But the plan failed, because every attempt to bury you only exposed another layer of endurance hidden within you. Now the same forces that once hunted your weakness recognize a terrifying reality. Your spirit has developed immunity, and immunity changes everything, because attacks that once shattered your peace now simply reveal themselves before they fully land. Your discernment catches deception faster, your instincts sense manipulation quicker, and your soul rejects environments that carry hidden destruction. This is why certain doors suddenly closed in your life recently, why certain relationships collapsed unexpectedly, why certain opportunities disappeared even when you wanted them desperately, because heaven was no longer allowing your spirit to remain connected to places designed to drain your future. The painful truth is that not everyone celebrating beside you was truly sent to protect you. Some people were assignments disguised as companionship, distractions disguised as love, lessons disguised as loyalty, and your suffering exposed them one by one, even when the separation hurt deeply at the time, because survival required your spirit to become lighter, stronger, and less dependent on unstable foundations. And although losing certain people wounded your heart temporarily, many of those departures were actually acts of divine protection preparing you for the next chapter of your life. This next season will feel unfamiliar at first, because you spent so long surviving that peace itself may seem strange. Your mind became accustomed to constant pressure, constant battles, constant emotional exhaustion, but heaven is slowly teaching your spirit how to live without fear controlling every decision, and this adjustment takes time because wounded souls often expect pain even after the danger has passed. But understand this clearly, your story has already shifted, the fire accomplished its purpose, the cycles attached to your suffering no longer carry the same authority they once held, and the person walking forward now is not the same fragile soul who entered those storms years ago. You are stepping into a season where your scars no longer represent defeat, but evidence of survival, evidence that God carried you through situations impossible to explain logically, evidence that darkness used its strongest weapons and still failed to erase your purpose. And because of this, your future will not resemble your past the same way anymore. The lessons remain, but the chains do not. The wisdom remains, but the torment does not. Memory remains, but the power behind it has already been broken, because once suffering finishes shaping a chosen spirit, it loses permission to define that spirit forever. And maybe this is the revelation your soul needed most, the realization that you were never abandoned during the battle, never forgotten during the silence, never weak for struggling under the pressure, because even while you cried, doubted, and questioned everything around you, heaven was still building strength beneath your brokenness, preparing a version of you capable of carrying authority that comfort alone could never create. And now the proof stands before the world clearly. You survived what was meant to destroy you. You rose from places where many people permanently collapse. And because you endured long enough to reach this moment, your future now carries something your past never could: freedom born through survival, wisdom born through suffering, and a spirit that darkness can recognize but never fully control again. And even now, while you listen to these words, something inside your spirit is awakening stronger than before, because the battles that once made you cry in silence are becoming the very reason your future will carry power, wisdom, peace, and authority that nobody will ever be able to steal from your life again.